And hello, my name is Madeline Austin Lehman. I am the Adult Programming Specialist at Warren Newport Public Library in Gurnee, Illinois. And this program is done in partnership with Lake County Women's Coalition and the National Park Service. Thank you so much for being here for Women's Equality Day. And I couldn't think of a better way to spend it than learning about the heritage of the women's rights movement and the right to vote movement, all of that has been going on for a couple hundred years now in this country. And I'm just so pleased that so many of you have joined us. And before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and pop some information in the chat. And since we are in a webinar format for this Zoom program, we are not in a meeting. You can see me and hear me, but I can't see you and I can't hear you. The only people that you'll be able to see and hear today it's me, and then we also have Susan here from the National Park Service, and she will be speaking later on today. So let me go ahead and put some information in that chat, and you'll see it pop up in possibly a little red bubble if you're on a desktop, or you'll see it pop it up on the bottom of your screen if you have a tablet or smartphone. And we have some information there on the Warren Newport Public Library, as well as the Lake County Women's Coalition. We have our websites there. You can see how to participate and be part of the community in the Warren Newport Township area and Lake County area. We have a whole bunch of different information on what to do, how to do it, and how to start. And one of the ways you can contribute and be part of the library community is to become a friend of the library. So to be a friend of the Warren Newport Public Library, you volunteer your time. There's a monthly donation or yearly donation. You can volunteer in the bookstore. There's so many opportunities available, and all of that fundraising money goes towards putting together beautiful programs like this today. And then we also have the Lake County Women's Coalition, where you can volunteer, become a member, and become an active, supportive community, women supporting women in our area. So without further ado, Susan, if you want to put your video on to make sure everything's working right. Hooray, hello, welcome Susan. And we will be going for about an hour, and we will have a Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, put it in the chat or use our Q&A function you'll see in the little bubble down below, and I'll be able to shout out your questions for Susan a little bit later. But other than that, thank you so much for being here with us today, and enjoy our program. Susan, it's off to you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank Debbie and Jean from the Lake County Women's Coalition for inviting me. My name is Susan Philpott, and I am a park ranger at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. Oh, and as I get this slideshow to start, I do have to mention that I have a little dog named Chester, and sometimes he barks. So I apologize if you can hear him barking there. And I'm trying to get the slideshow to start, and it's giving me a little bit of a hard time. Okay. There we go. All right. So my pronouns are she and her, and my email is there. I can give it to you again at the end if you would like to contact us at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, where we tell the story of the fight for women's right to vote, particularly the fight for the 19th Amendment and the ongoing struggle for women's equality. And my site is part of the National Mall, but became a National Park Service site when it was declared a national monument by President Obama on April 12th, 2016. And when President Obama gave a speech at that establishment day, he said, I want young girls and boys to come here 10, 20, 100 years from now to know that women fought for equality. It was not just given to them. And that date of April 12th is significant because in 2016, 5 years ago, that was Equal Pay Day. Equal Pay Day originated by the National Committee on Pay Equity to illustrate the gap in pay from between women and men. And the date symbolizes how far into the year women on average must work to earn what men earned in the previous year. And this is what my park looks like. Maybe not what you think of when you think of the National Park Service. It's a 200-year-old brick house on the corner of Constitution Avenue and 2nd Street Northeast in the middle of Washington, D.C. We're across the street from the Supreme Court building, right on Capitol Hill. The white building that you see kind of hugging the house there is the Hart Senate office building. So a lot of senators have their offices and look right out over us. There have been a lot of protests at the Hart Senate Office building over the past couple of years, particularly for issues having to do with rights and equality. So it's so interesting to be talking about people protesting for equality right next door to the place where people are still doing it. The reason it's a part of the National Park Service is because it was the longtime headquarters of the National Women's Party, founded by Alice Paul, who we're going to talk about. And it's no accident that this space is located right here in the heart of Washington, D.C., right in the middle of power. Until 1997, the National Women's Party was a political organization, a lobbying organization. And they saw themselves as more than that. One of the and National Women's Party members said, it's not merely a headquarters for our party that we plan, but an embassy for the women of our nation, a center of thought and activity, and a vantage point from which they may keep Congress under perpetual observation. So that idea of making themselves visible right there in the heart of power and holding that power accountable. This is what the hallway, the entranceway looked like in 1974, right around the time just before Alice Paul retired, when she was still living and working there. And this is the entranceway today. Since 1997, the National Women's Party was a educational nonprofit, and so they began operating the headquarters as a museum. They couldn't lobby anymore. Now they were keeping Alice Paul's mission going by telling the story, which can be a radical act in its own right. And the National Women's Party continued to operate until December of 2020. So they just dissolved and unified with the Alice Paul Institute in New Jersey and transferred the collections. So the papers all went to the Library of Congress, and all of the things you see here, the artwork and you'll see textiles and other three-dimensional things, those are all now being cared for by the National Park Service. But we're still interpreting the exhibits that they created. And you can get a sense looking at this entranceway of that you really feel as you're in there, you know that you are in a place that honors and recognizes women. And then this is looking down the hallway the other way, as if that stained glass window is behind you. You can get another look at some of these paintings and statues. The little bust that's closest to you in the screen here is Susan B. Anthony. If people know one name in women's rights, they usually have heard of Susan B. Anthony. But some of the other faces probably would not be familiar to you. Even if I told you their names, you might not be familiar with them. This really gives us a sense that, you know, the work of change, the work of fighting for equality, there might be a couple leaders who get their name in the history books, but there are lots and lots of other people behind that work. One of them, who we're not going to talk about too much today, but whose bust is on the far pedestal here, we'll see another picture of her later, is Alva Belmont. She's the Belmont of the Belmont Paul, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. She was a very wealthy woman who used her wealth to support the cause of women's suffrage, and particularly to support the work of Alice Paul, who she saw as kind of a kindred spirit. She wanted someone who was going to shake things up, and Alice was the one to do that for her. So as we go through, you're not going to see too many pictures of Alva. You know, she's not out there getting arrested, but it's her money that's making just about everything happen. You don't just need courage and creativity, you need the cash too. And her money bought this house, which they named for her. And this is the other side of that same hallway. This is a bust of Alice Paul, just closest to you. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the founding mothers, on the far wall. And you also see this great big mirror. The house had the mirrors when the National Women's Party moved in. And then when they created these museum exhibits, the National Women's Party really turned these into interactive spaces. So we'll be looking at some of the mirrors as we go through. And you'll notice that this one in the entranceway has a sticker that looks like a frame on it right here. So if you were standing here in the hallway looking at yourself in the mirror, it would look like you had a frame around you, like you were one of these troublemakers up here on the wall. So the things that all of these people had, you have them too, Alice might say to you. She said that the movement was like a mosaic. Everybody had their one little stone that they put in their thing that they could do, that they could contribute. And then at the end, you have a beautiful work of art. And this is looking into the first exhibit room. We call it the Origins Gallery. That's looking at how Alice Paul got involved in the suffrage movement, how the National Women's Party got started. And two treasured items of the National Women's Party that we now care for are these two pieces of furniture. On the right, you see a chair, and this chair once belonged to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, along with Lucretia Mott and other women, organized the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in July 1848. I think that one of the titles for this event was thought to be, maybe it would be After Seneca Falls, and we're quite a bit after Seneca Falls, the story we're telling, but we really can root this story in that gathering of reform-minded people getting together to talk specifically about women's rights and drawing up their mission statement, the Declaration of Sentiments, which borrowed from the Declaration of Independence, except it said all men and women are created equal. And most of that document is a list of all the ways women were not treated equally. It was a really long list in 1848. Just to point it out, I just want to mention, it's hard to tell in this picture, but the seat of this chair is really long, much longer than an average chair. And that was done because women had to wear these huge bustles on their dresses. And so they needed even different furniture to sit in. And that is the environment in which Elizabeth Cady Stanton has the strength, the vision to say, we need to change things. And one of the first things she says is that they resolve that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise, voting. Another word for that is suffrage. You even see the little, in the display behind here, the little old voting machine here. And that, even among these radical abolitionists and reform-minded people, seemed a little crazy. Elizabeth, women voting, that's now you're getting ridiculous. And actually it was Frederick Douglass, as far as we know, the only African-American at that first Women's Rights Convention, although Black women and men would be very involved in the fight for a women's right to vote. He stood up and said, basically backed Elizabeth up and said, if you want the rest of the things on the list, then you need the vote too. And the women's rights movement continued for many decades, working on all kinds of things on that list: property rights, right to children, right to earn money and get an education, right to divorce. But eventually they began to focus on the vote, that once you have the ballot, you've got the power. And then next to that chair, which was given by her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, is a desk. And this desk belonged to Susan B. Anthony, who spent her entire life really on the road fighting for women's right to vote. She just was on the trains, out giving speeches, lobbying wherever she could. Anywhere there might be a chance that women could win the ballot, Susan B. Anthony was there. And one of the places she came was here in DC. So she had an office here, and this desk was in her office. Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, 4 years after her dear friend Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So they didn't get to see women win the vote. They worked on it their whole lives. Susan's long-term secretary had this desk and gave it to Alice Paul in 1913 as a way to say, you know, you are taking up the work that Susan started. And here is a group of National Women's Party members gathered around that desk. This is Alice Paul standing next to it. And there's Alva Belmont sitting down next to the desk, which they've taken outside, I guess, to get a better picture. But actually, Alice Paul never met Susan B. Anthony, and that's not who got her involved in the fight for women's right to vote. She got fired up while she was attending graduate school in England, and she met the militant suffragettes led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters. Now, just like Susan B. Anthony, they could give really impassioned speeches, and they could do all that kind of on the ground work, but they didn't think anything was going to change by talking about it. They'd been talking for too long, and if they wanted change, they thought they really needed to cause trouble. So they would do things like have big demonstrations that would shut down all the traffic in the city. They would show up where politicians were talking and heckle and interrupt them. They'd break into places where women weren't allowed, basically make it so they couldn't be ignored. And their slogan was deeds, not words. And some of those deeds were things like throwing rocks and breaking windows. Later on in the movement, they did even more acts of vandalism. For all of these things, though, which were considered very transgressive for women, they got arrested. They went to jail. This picture on the right is Emmeline Pankhurst getting arrested. They weren't ashamed of going to jail. They kind of wore it as a badge of honor. And they started, while in jail, continuing to cause trouble by going on hunger strikes. They're the first ones to use the hunger strike on a large scale as a form of protest. And they were force-fed in prison, which is just a brutal process. And Alice Paul gets involved in these things. First, she starts just giving little speeches or handing things out, but eventually she's doing the things with the suffragettes that are getting her arrested. And she went on hunger strikes and she was force-fed. And she became kind of a celebrity in the US as the papers, the press is reporting on these antics of this crazy American girl. So when she returned to the United States, she was met at the dock in Philadelphia as her ship came in by a gaggle of reporters who all want to know, Miss Paul, are you going to join the American women's suffrage movement? And her response was, I didn't know there was an American women's suffrage movement, which must not have sat too well with the very large American women's suffrage movement. There was a national organization that had kind of an awkward name, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. We call it NASA for short. You see some of the leadership here on the right. In the middle here on the left is Anna Howard Shaw, who was leading it in 1910 when Alice Paul came back to the US. She was very accomplished and a dynamic speaker. On the right is Carrie Chapman Catt, who took over leadership in 1915. She was a great political strategist and organizer. And what was this young crazy girl talking about, not knowing about the years that these women had put in to the fight for women's right to vote? They had worked side by side with Susan B. Anthony. And what they were doing is fighting for women to win the vote at the state level. And they'd had some success. There were some states in the West where women could vote on the same terms as men, and other states where women had won the vote in school board elections or in local municipal elections. When Alice Paul came back, she was finishing up her PhD, but then by 1912, she's jumping in full force into the fight for women's right to vote here in America. Some of those other suffragists, there was a large suffrage contingent in Illinois. Here on the left is Grace Wilbur Trout, who became a very prominent Illinois suffragist. And on the right, you might recognize Jane Addams. And Jane Addams kind of took Alice Paul under her wing and brought her to the NASA leadership and said, basically, you know, you need to let this young woman do what she's get involved and take some leadership roles. She's fired up. So it was Jane Addams who kind of smooth things over for Alice Paul to start working with NASA. This is my favorite, not only my favorite Illinois suffragist, but really my favorite suffragist, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was internationally known as an investigative journalist and a civil rights activist and speaker. She'd been fighting against and exposing the truths about the horrors of lynching, which had gotten her basically run out of Memphis. Her paper was destroyed, her life was threatened, and so she moved to Chicago eventually, where she started, and among the many things that she was working on was women's suffrage, began the first Black women's club that was specifically dedicated to women's suffrage, the Alpha Suffrage Club. There were lots, Black women had a very extensive club organization working for a lot of things. Ida was the one who started a club specifically for women's suffrage. We're going to revisit Ida B. Wells in a minute. So Alice Paul decides that she needs to bring some of that energy that she saw in Britain here to the US movement. Now she doesn't start breaking windows, but she thinks of the spectacle of the pageantry that she saw with the suffragettes. And she wanted to bring that here to the US. And so she decides that she wants to organize a procession down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. on the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration in 1913. Take over the inaugural route, make an argument right here in the nation's capital that women have been excluded from this political process, and we are going to show you why we should be included. And the next day, the president's going to have to be walking in our footsteps. And she organized thousands of women from around the country to come to represent their states, to represent their professions, to represent their universities. Here you see the university women lining up. There were bands and elaborate floats, as you see in the picture here on the right. And the procession starts out with the woman in the upper left-hand corner here. That is Inez Milholland, all in white on a white horse. The new woman of the 20th century. Alice Paul is saying, this is not your grandmother's suffrage movement. This is what a feminist looks like. And Inez was kind of a star at the time in the suffrage movement, and lots of people knew her. She was a lawyer when women could barely get admitted to law school or to practice law. She was a civil rights advocate. Her father was one of the founders of the NAACP, and she was a dynamic speaker on these causes. But she was also really pretty, and people called her the most beautiful suffragist. So that's part of what Alice Paul is saying when she puts her out front there. This is what a feminist looks like. I just want to point out that the crown she's wearing with the Star of Hope on top would eventually inspire Wonder Woman's tiara. So Inez was one of the first Wonder Women. And the story that Alice Paul is telling as she's organizing this lineup in the procession is really a white woman's story. That's what she knows. That's what she's got in her head. She sort of has a sense that maybe if a Black woman would march, she even reached out to some women at Howard University. But then she gets the word from the locals in DC and others on the procession committee that, oh, Alice, that's not the way things are done here. This is really the South, and Southern women just won't have it. The Southern white women, anyway, just won't have it if you have Black and white marching together. So then Alice Paul tries to convince Black women not to march, but they won't have it. She tries to say, well, then maybe you should march in the back. And sometimes when you hear stories with this procession, you will hear that Black women marched in the back. I think it's clear that Alice Paul wanted them to, and even in her old age remembers that would happen, but I don't think it did, because the Black women would not. They said, no, we're going to march where we belong. One of those groups that marched was a brand new sorority founded at Howard University, Delta Sigma Theta, with the purpose of being socially and civically active. And so the first thing that the Deltas do is march in the suffrage procession with their mentor, Mary Church Terrell, here on the right, who is an internationally known civil rights advocate and women's suffragist. She has spoken at conferences all around the country and even around the world in Berlin. And she make sure that those young college students march with the other college women. And she says later that it's Inez Milholland who makes sure that they don't get pushed to the back. So the real vision of the new woman of the 20th century perhaps is someone who's interested in real equality. And now I said we'd get back to Illinois. This is the Illinois state delegation getting ready to line up. It's not a great picture, but somehow as they're lining up, Grace Trout gets a word from someone that they can't have Black and white women marching together in the state delegation. So she turns to the delegation's only Black member, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and tells her, you know, sorry, Ida, I guess you have to go march in the back. And Ida, who's the most famous suffragist there, by the way, from Illinois, is just furious. And she says, no, she says, I was asked to come here to march and represent Illinois, and I intend to do that or not march at all. And she storms off, and two of her friends, Virginia Arnold and Belle Squire, go with her, allies. And the rest of the Illinois delegation doesn't know what's happened to them. They line up, they get started. They think maybe they've left or they've gone to the back, but they have done neither. They are waiting along the parade route. And when the Illinois delegation passes by, they step right out in front. So here is Ida B. Wells right there in the middle. And this is Virginia, I'm sorry, Virginia Brooks is her name. Virginia Brooks and Belle Squire, her two allies, they're there with her. They are leading the Illinois delegation, and the Chicago Daily Tribune captured this great picture of it. Unfortunately, we don't have the original picture. We only have the picture of the newspaper. At Belmont Hall, we say you can't spell formidable without Ida B. So they've got a message. And the first float that everybody sees as this procession continues has their main purpose written right on it. It says, we demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of this country. On the left, you see a replica banner in the museum. On the right, you kind of see the float with that on it, but you can't really see it because, as you can see, the crowds are swarming the procession. Now, this is a bold statement. They're saying, we're tired of this incremental progress. We want to change the US Constitution to guarantee the vote for every woman in the country. But the most shocking word is that word demand. You know, respectable, gracious, gentle women are not supposed to demand things. They are trying to get a reaction and stir people up, and it works. As you can see, the crowds don't stay on the sidewalks. They swarm into the way of the procession, and then rowdy men start manhandling the women and grabbing them, spitting on them. Women get pulled down off the floats and trampled. It becomes a huge melee. The police do nothing to break it up. They sort of stand by and watch and say, you know, if you'd stayed home, you wouldn't have had this trouble. It's not till the cavalry comes in from Arlington to clear the route that the procession finally finishes. They do finish. And the next day, the newspapers all around the country not really talking about Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. They're all talking about this women's suffrage procession, and Alice Paul's got everybody's attention. And that really energizes the women's suffrage movement, which had been in kind of a doldrums there for a while. And with renewed energy in this cause for change comes renewed energy in the opposition, the anti-suffragists that get more organized and more determined and raise more money. And one of the ways that is often used against those who are fighting for change is ridicule. And so one of the ways that women were ridiculed was using cat imagery. because, you know, it makes as much sense to give the vote to a cat as it does to a woman. And don't they all sound like cats meowing about their rights? And on the left, you see here what we call Suffrage Cat, the postcard of the cat in her suffrage regalia and fantastic hat. That's meant to be anti-suffrage, but we have reclaimed Suffrage Cat as a women's equality symbol. So if you thought cat memes were a new thing, they've been around for at least 100 years. So in fighting this anti-suffrage effort, the women really have to articulate what it is that they want and why. This is a word cloud in the museum, but it's echoing those words that were in the Declaration of Sentiments. What do we want? We want independence. We want justice. We want a right to ourselves. We want self-reliance. We want a voice. Unfortunately, one of the things that in the early 20th century that white women suffragists also start to say is, well, you know, if women have the vote, that will help you maintain white supremacy, because white women's votes will cancel out any Black men and women who manage to get through all the barriers and obstacles and violence put in their way of voting. There was this sense among the white leaders that they needed the South. And in order to get the South, they had to pander to segregationists. This is another room that we call the Strategies and Tactics room. And, you know, sometimes when you're just looking at big moments in history, it could seem like, okay, you have a march and then things are fixed. And that's never how things happen. A march or a protest might open up the conversation, but then you got to do the work. As it says around that table in there, the quote from Alva Belmont, it says, ours is the hard work, the painful work, the slow work, the phone calls, the letter writing, the petitions, the trying to get the word out, the letters to the editor. So they get to work. And one of the first things that Alice Paul starts to do is to publish a newspaper to get the word out. It's called The Suffragist. You can see some printing blocks over on the right there. This really annoys the NASA leaders because NASA already has a newspaper. It's called the Women's Journal. Why is this young woman thinks she can publish her own newspaper? And oh, by the way, her first issue is making fun of the new president. And the cartoon, they don't like that at all. That's not the way we get things done. We don't antagonize people. We are gentle and respectable. Alice Paul likes to antagonize people. And so pretty quickly, she breaks away from NASA and forms her own organization. Initially, it's called the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. They will change their name to the National Women's Party later. It's always a small part of the larger women's suffrage movement, but they're the ones that are good at getting the headlines. And they also have their own cartoonist, Nina Allender, who is a classically trained painter who Alice Paul convinced to become a cartoonist. That was kind of her way. She'd just show up and before you knew it, whatever it was she was asking, you were going to say yes. And Nina Allender, it didn't end up thinking this was an insult. She said that it was really empowering to get her message out through her art. What became known as the Allender girl is young, stylish, sophisticated, often has her hands on her hips and her chin up, and she's out in public, which is not a place that women are supposed to be. Women are supposed to be at home taking care of the children and doing the laundry. But Nina Allender's women in her cartoons are empowered. They're out there and they're fighting. This is an example of one of her cartoons that you can see the whole message that's going on in here. The poor woman without the vote, Cinderella, who needs that constitutional amendment, needs that pumpkin changed into a coach that will take her to liberty and justice. But those rats in the House and Senate, we need them to pass this constitutional amendment. And so she's looking to her fairy godmother, who is Woodrow Wilson. Fairy godmother Wilson, wave your magic wand and convince those rats in the House and Senate to pass this constitutional amendment. It's going to be a big job, and they want the president on their side because they got to convince all those guys up on Capitol Hill, and it's all men until 1917. So they get really good at lobbying. You can see on the left here, Elizabeth Colt teaching people about the members of Congress and where they stand on suffrage. And these lobbying campaigns, they kept notes about everything, not just where a member of Congress stood on suffrage, but everything else they could find out about him. What did they know about his funders? What are his other issues? Who are his allies? Where does he golf? Where does he go to church? What do we know about his mom and his wife? This was very disconcerting to the members of Congress who'd never had anybody know this kind of things about them. They didn't collect any scandalous information, at least they didn't write it down on the cards, but the members of Congress didn't know that. And it could be a little, they got a little shook up, particularly when these women could get a barrage of letters coming in from their constituents about the issue of suffrage. And if you want to change members of Congress's mind, you got to change their constituents' minds too. So they went on campaigns all around the country. These are women on the suffrage special on a train tour around the country to convince particularly women who have the vote that, you know, you have a power the rest of us don't. Use it to support the women who don't have it. Use it to demand that your politicians support this amendment to the Constitution. So mostly they went to the West, but another place they went was to Illinois, because in 1913, women in Illinois won not only municipal suffrage, but also suffrage in the presidential election. So they could vote for president. And so the suffrage special ended up in Illinois, and here they are putting up a big banner. By the way, that's Virginia Davis there again, up on the building, putting this up. This is the National Women's Party's headquarters in Chicago. And you can see here that they are campaigning against Woodrow Wilson. They haven't gotten Wilson on board. He's been blowing them off, saying, you know, ladies, I'm very busy. This is not an issue for me. This is a states' rights issue. Go back to your states and ask for the vote if you want it. And so in the 1916 campaign, they are saying basically women who have the vote, vote against Wilson. They don't even mention the other candidate, who is Charles Evans Hughes, but just vote against Wilson. This is considered really transgressive as well. Women are not supposed to get involved in partisan politics. It's supposed to be like an utterly ugly, dirty business, only for men. I noticed some men in the crowds. I don't know if they're supporting them or laughing at them in this picture. It doesn't work. Wilson is reelected, although Illinois does go for Charles Evans Hughes. So it works in Illinois, but not in most of the other states where women have the vote. So they decide by 1917 they need a new tactic. And that's when they start the campaign that they're best known for. They begin to picket the White House. They're the first ones who ever protest at the White House. We're going to bring this battle right to Woodrow Wilson's doorstep. And here is the first contingent of picketers lined up with their banners, and you can see they all have sashes on here. It's black and white, so you can't tell, but they are in the suffrage colors, the trademark colors of purple, white, and gold. And you'll notice both the tricolored banners and the sashes don't have any words on them. They don't even need to put words on them. These colors have been so associated with the cause of women's right to vote. So they show up in January when it's kind of cold out. They take up positions at the White House gates and stand there all day long, not really saying anything or engaging anybody, just holding up these great big banners. In addition to the tricolored banners, they also have ones with big block lettering with words on them, often Woodrow Wilson's own words. Mr. President, you say liberty is the fundamental demand of the human spirit. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? This is a mirror in the museum where you can stand there and look as if you're holding that banner. And we have some of the original banners in our collection. On the left, you see, Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? And on the right is my favorite one. The young are at the gates. So watch out, the new generation is coming and we're demanding justice. So some people are just appalled by this new tactic. Carrie Chapman Catt, the head of NASA, can't believe it. She says, "What are you doing? You are making a mockery of the suffrage cause. You're making us look ridiculous. Respectable women do not stand on street corners." But other people really admire them. They're out there day after day for months in all kinds of weather. They've got people coming in from around the country to take a turn on the picket line. This is a group of Illinois suffragists who are ready for Illinois Day to go out and picket. And they're getting more publicity, they're getting more attention, they're building support. But then the US enters World War I of April 1917. And now these women are out there protesting a president during wartime. That doesn't just seem unladylike. That's unpatriotic, maybe even un-American. Who do these women think they are? And rather than back off, Alice Paul and the National Women's Party kind of turn up the heat. They keep picketing, and the words on the banners start to get more and more provocative. Like, how can you say we are fighting this war to make the world safe for democracy? We don't have democracy here if women can't vote. Mr. President, you are deceiving the world. Well, that does not go over very well with crowds in DC who begin to rip the banners down and attack the women. Here you see a crowd descending on them that's full of you can see Navy sailors in there too. And the police have to break this up. They get very fed up with dealing with this violence at the White House. So they say, "That's it, Alice Paul, no more picketing. You ladies show up here again and we're gonna arrest you." And Alice Paul said, "It wasn't illegal in January when we started. It's not illegal now. We have a right. We're not stopping." And so they keep picketing. And as promised, they are arrested. Here are two National Women's Party picketers getting arrested. Catherine Flanagan on the left, and over here, Madeline Watson of Chicago, among some of the first women to get arrested. And they're charged with obstructing traffic for standing on the sidewalk, which is just a fine, but they won't pay the fine. So women are then sent to jail. At first, it's just 3 days in jail, but the women keep picketing, keep getting arrested. The judge gets frustrated and then starts to really throw the book at them. 30 days, 60 days, and not in the DC jail. Now you're going to go to the women's prison, the Occoquan workhouse, where the conditions are just horrifying. On the left here is Lucy Burns, who spent more time in the American suffragist who spent more time in prison than any other American woman. She would go to jail, get out, and go right back on the picket line the next day, figuring that this will really deter them, but it doesn't. More and more women keep showing up. I met one woman whose grandmother and great aunt were living in New York and saw an ad in the paper that said, "Come and picket, you will be arrested." They came and they were. By October 1917, Alice Paul's got so many of her leaders in prison that she's decided she's got to be the one out on the picket line, which is dangerous. They're gunning for her. This is her heading out to picket with a banner that says, "The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there is but one choice. We have made it." And those, as you can see, are the words of Woodrow Wilson when he was asking for a declaration of war. And so Alice Paul is turning it around. Yes, we feel that way too. She once said, "When men are denied justice, they go to war. This is our war, only we're fighting it with banners instead of guns." So as soon as she gets out there, she's arrested, and her sentence is 7 months. They try to send her to the asylum because they think she must be insane, that she's unhealthily obsessed with Woodrow Wilson. Fortunately, the doctor won't commit her. He says there's nothing wrong with her brain. She just wants to vote. But the women all begin to protest their conditions through hunger strikes, just like in Britain. And just like in Britain, the response is to force feed them. And this is a description from Lucy Burns about what that force feeding was like. I was held down by 5 people at legs, arms, and head. I refused to open mouth. Dr. Gannon pushed tube up left nostril. I turned and twisted my head all I could, but he managed to push it up. It hurts nose and throat very much and makes nose bleed freely. Tube drawn out, covered with blood. Operation leaves one very sick. Food dumped directly into stomach, feels like a ball of lead. Left nostril, throat, and muscles of neck very sore all night. And women endured this torture over and over again. But they're good at making sure everybody knows what's happening. They're good at keeping people talking. This is from a note that Lucy managed to sneak out that gets published in the press. They've got people like Alva Belmont out giving interviews and telling the story about what's going on, and public opinion starts to shift. I mean, maybe we thought these women were a little crazy and troublesome, but you know, that doesn't mean they ought to be tortured. And so eventually outrage builds enough that Woodrow Wilson pardons all the women, and they're all released at the end of November, just in time to get home and cook Thanksgiving dinner for their family, as the press reports. But that doesn't stop their protesting. One of the first things they do a few days later is have a big ceremony where everyone who's been to prison gets a jail door pin that they wear very proudly. They also then head out around the country on the prison special, telling the stories of what has happened to them. This is the prison special taking a stop in Chicago. This is Lucy Burns right over here. And, you know, saying, sometimes they even dress in their prison clothes, not in this picture, but, and they say, you know, this is why we need the vote right now. This is what happens in your own country when you don't have the voice. Well, eventually, Woodrow Wilson starts to say that, as a matter of fact, he does support an amendment to the Constitution enfranchising women. Not, he makes it clear, because of all those troublemakers who've been bothering him at his doorstep, but it's because he wants to reward all the respectable, gracious, gentle women who have supported the war so faithfully on the home front. Whatever the reason for his change of heart, it turned out that they were right to target Woodrow Wilson for support, because his speech before Congress is the thing that really gets the amendment moving. Now, like everything with Congress, it takes a while. So it's not until June of 1919 that the amendment passes through Congress, with the National Women's Party causing trouble all the way up until that moment. But then it does pass. Victory! Woohoo! But of course, that's only the first part of amending the Constitution. Now you've got to get it ratified by 3/4 of the states. By this point, 28 states have some form of women's suffrage. So what had seemed so crazy and ridiculous when Elizabeth Cady Stanton first announced it now has become more commonplace. And it turns out, despite what the anti-suffragists said, that society has not collapsed with women voting. So there are a lot of states that are on board to ratify this amendment as quickly as possible. In fact, Illinois is in such a hurry to be first, and they are the very first to vote to ratify, they make a mistake. And so then they have to go back a week later and re-ratify it again. So although on our map here, Illinois is shown after Wisconsin and Michigan, we all know that Illinois actually was first. All of the states you see here in gold or kind of brown are states that ratify the amendment. Now, the suffragists really think we have got to get this amendment through before the November 1920 election, because there's going to be a new president. We need women voting for that president, because once you have a new president, everything can change. That's a really short window to get things done. So this battle is now spreading out all across the country. I just want to point out here, the states in gray do not ratify before the amendment gets its needed 36. Every time that a state ratifies the amendment, the National Women's Party, keeping up the publicity, they've turned their suffrage banners now into ratification banners. And so here on the left, you see Alice Paul sewing a star on a ratification banner with other women gathered around her, looking like a new Betsy Ross there. And on the right is a Nina Allender cartoon that's showing the latest ratifications: Arkansas, Nebraska, and Montana. But over here on the left, oh no, Georgia has said no. And several states will vote no on ratification, including my home state of Maryland. So by March of 1920, they have 35 states. They need one more, 36, but then things get stuck. States aren't going to call sessions at all, or states are voting no. So when it comes up for a vote in Tennessee, we'll do that page in a second. When it comes up for a vote in Tennessee, everybody thinks this is our last chance. And so they're meeting there in August in the heat, and the Tennessee State Senate votes to ratify the amendment, and it goes to the Tennessee State House, and they hold a vote, and it's a tie. Oh, you're kidding me. All this time, all this work, it's come down basically to getting one guy to change his vote. The suffs and the antis are both down there lobbying and campaigning. One of the things they're doing is giving out roses to their supporters. So as the men gather to take another vote, they've all got a rose pinned to their lapel. If it's a yellow rose, he's a suff, he's going to vote yes. But if it's a red rose, he's an anti, he's going to vote no. If you were in that chamber counting up roses, you'd say, looks like the antis have it, or at least it's going to be another tie. Harry Byrne over here on the left, the youngest guy there, only 24, is wearing the red rose, but he's also got a letter in his jacket pocket that he's just gotten. It's a long letter, but part of it reads, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt." And it's signed, "Don't forget to be a good boy. Lots of love. Mama." This is Mama over here on the right, Feb Byrne. Harry Byrne listened to his mama and changed his vote. And that was the one vote that made the difference. Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 1920, 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention. The women of this country had, in fact, ensured to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. This is Harry Byrne right here in the middle, shaking hands with National Women's Party members who've been down there in Nashville and fighting for it. The woman right here, Anita Politzer, her great niece, Patty, is one of our volunteers, and she says the story and the Politzer family is, you know, that story of the letter from Mom is nice, but really it was Anita that convinced him that he needed to support suffrage. It wasn't quite over after the vote. There was still some pull back and forth and disputing things, but on August 26, 1920, Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby certified that the 19th Amendment had 36 state ratifications and it became part of the US Constitution. He did that in his house early in the morning, so there was no great gathering of all the suffrage leaders, no great photograph, no one got a ceremonial pen. But so what we have is this picture here of Alice Paul unfurling that ratification banner completed with 36 stars over the balcony of the headquarters of the National Women's Party. And since 1973, we have celebrated August 26th as Women's Equality Day. But of course, August 26th is not the day that women won equality. It's just the day they won the vote. The vote was not the end. The vote was just the beginning. In fact, Alice Paul says right after, "It's incredible to me that any woman should consider the fight for full equality won. It has just begun. There is hardly a field, economic or political, in which the natural and unaccustomed policy is not to ignore women. Unless women are prepared to fight politically, they must be content to be ignored politically." And so they went to work fighting politically, using that deadly political index and their lobbying skills to start fighting to get laws changed that treated women unequally. They made their own list a new declaration of sentiments that they call the Declaration of Principles. And a lot of the stuff from 72 years ago is still on the list. And it started with this preamble: whereas women today, although enfranchised, are still in every way subordinate to men before the law, in government, in educational opportunities, in the professions, in church, in the industry, in the home. So the vote is one thing, but everything else is still needs to be done. And this Nina Allender cartoon shows two women holding on to their vote, but the spirit of Susan B. Anthony is pointing at the Bill of Rights and saying everything but the vote is still to be won. Another thing that women start to do immediately is run for office. It's not enough to be casting your ballot, your votes, your name's got to be on the ballot. If you want real change, you got to be in the room where the decisions get made. And so one of the mirrors in the museum, and I love it when young people are standing there looking in this mirror, says, "I will run for office." This idea that women need to see themselves as the leaders, as the change makers, to jump in and not think that they have to be some kind of Wonder Woman to make things happen. As Shirley Chisholm, who you see here in the middle, the first African-American woman elected to Congress, would say, if they won't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And the National Women's Party also really quickly goes back to the idea of amending the US Constitution again. This time, not just for the vote, but for full equality. Alice Paul and the National Women's Party are the ones who proposed the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA as it's known. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And they didn't do the kinds of things that they had done in fight for the 19th Amendment in support of the ERA, partially because the National Women's Party were the only ones out there fighting for this. All the other women's groups didn't think that this was a good idea, that this was a bridge too far. It would take a new generation of women, the new young at the gates, who would stand up and start to push again for equality with the second wave feminists, and for the Equal Rights Amendment to be one of the things that they fight for. They got the amendment passed in 1972, but they couldn't get it ratified before the time limit expired. The Congress put a time limit on it. It expired in 1982. And so everybody thought the ERA was dead, except that suddenly in 2017, Nevada voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And then, as you probably know, Illinois did too. And then in January of 2020, Virginia did. Well, those were the three missing states, except for that time limit. And also that some states have also rescinded their ratification. So we don't know what's going to happen with the ERA. That thing that Alice Paul was fighting for, it's still out there. One thing that the National Women's Party didn't do, even though many people asked them to, is to look at the ways that people are unequally treated as it comes to voting. There were women right away, like Mary Church Terrell, who were asking them to take up the issue of lynching and racial violence, to take up things like intimidation and violence at the polls, poll taxes, literacy tests they can't pass. But that white voters seem to be able to always pass with no problem. And then you look at some of the other things, some of these things still exist today. And it's a question of, well, if they're applied equally, but they affect people differently, is that equality? The National Women's Party never took this issue up. They said it was a race issue, not a sex issue. And they did not make common cause with those fighting for civil rights. So that leads us to the question of what is equality? And what does equality look like now in the 21st century? This is a picture from the Women's March in 2018, where they have a banner that had been used in a 1970s march with the Equal Rights Amendment on it. And you can see different signs from people standing there of things that these people see as part of the issue of equality. One of the reasons that I love telling the story is because a lot of times people don't know this story. They probably have heard of Susan B. Anthony, and I hope they know that women can vote. But when you don't know how it happens, you might get the impression that things just kind of work out, that it gets better, that equality shows up eventually. And so far, at least, that has never been the way things change. They change because people fight for it and work at it and struggle. And sometimes they have to do the work and never get to see the end. They have to pass it on to the next generation, to the new young at the gates. So I hope that as you see things that need to change, that you might get a little inspiration from Alice Paul and all those troublemakers at the National Women's Party.
Susan, thank you so very much. You are an absolute wealth of information.
Oh,
We could have
you.
listened to you for another whole hour.
Yeah, I went a little long. Sorry about
I know,
that.
take a drink of water. In the meantime, what we're going to do is answer any questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function, type them on in. We'd be happy to take them, and we'll give you that sort of low minute to type all that in. But in the meantime, Susan, I just want to say thank you so much for giving us a tour of history, of your space, of obviously what you're passionate about. It's so wonderful to hear all the nitty-gritty details, even down to stitching stars. I love that. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Oh yeah, and I see someone, yes, the focus on Illinois, yes.
Yes, you spoiled us.
Yes, lots of great stories out of Illinois.
All right, we have some questions from Nan. Do you see it as well, Susan?
Yes, so a question about whether the museum is open now. It is not. This is the only way that you can tour right now. In addition to being closed for the pandemic, which we have been since March of 2020, it's a small space and an old house that doesn't have great ventilation, but also it's an old house that needs work on it. That's one of the reasons that the National Women's Party wanted to make sure that the National Park Service would care for it. So we have to do a big renovation, and we're in the midst of sort of dealing with the collections and things, and it could be that we won't get to open before the renovation work starts. We don't have a definite date for that. Maybe we'll get to open for a month or two, but we are not open now, but we are available to give ranger talks to groups anytime. Just let us know, and we would love to make that happen. Isn't it great that we can do so many things virtually? How many visitors do we get in a non-pandemic year? And is it an independent national park? So it is a unit of the National Mall. So we are part of a much larger park that includes not only the memorials and the Washington Monument, but also Ford's Theater. Also, Pennsylvania Avenue is part of our park. So maybe we'll be able to start giving tours, women's suffrage tours on Pennsylvania Avenue. And all the, if you're familiar with DC, all the little circles and parks all through DC are all part of the National Mall. We don't get a lot of visitors. We're kind of off the beaten path, and buses can't come up there because it's a Capitol Hill, but we're hoping that with the centennial of the 19th Amendment and getting able to reach so many more people virtually, that when we're able to reopen, that we'll get a lot more people coming to see us. Do you have any other questions? So I see a question about my career. I came to the Park Service kind of as a second career, second part of life, and I have spent my entire Park Service career at the National Mall. I started out working at the memorials, at the Lincoln Memorial, at the Martin Luther King Memorial, which is really where I got fired up about the issue, the history of civil rights and fighting for equality, that long struggle. So then I left to go to grad school, and then came back, as it turned out, to the same park, and was really shocked that in all that studying that I had not learned anything about these women fighting for the vote, that in all my studying of civil rights, I didn't know about this large movement for civil rights in America. So when Belmont Hall became a part of the National Mall, I raised my hand and said, yes, I want to work there. I want to learn that story and tell that story. And I've been there, but it's a total of 10 years. Just hit my 10-year mark.
That's amazing. And Debbie just mentioned, love the tiara anecdote.
Yes. So now there's a lot more to Wonder Woman than just Inez. If you read Jill Lepore's The Secret History of Wonder Woman, you will learn many more things that you probably didn't want to know about Wonder Woman's tiara, but Inez is in there. So I see a question about the she, her, her signature. So I like to start out with my pronouns because it's a way, at least to me, of being inclusive and moving further towards equality. You know, if only people who, if only certain people feel like they have to say what their pronouns are, then they are marginalized. And this is a way for me to be an ally, like Belle Squire and Virginia Davis, you know, with Ida B. Wells, to stand up and say, yes, that you are not alone.
And we did get something in the Q&A from Jean, just saying how the presentation was fantastic, and that on behalf of the Lake County Women's Coalition, thank you for your time, your energy, your knowledge, and your passion.
It was my pleasure. So thank you so much, everybody. This has been great. Thank you for the opportunity to meet all you great Illinois women, and keep up the fight and supporting women.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. And we will absolutely be sending this recording out. So watch your emails. I'll get that done in the next couple days as we wait for Zoom to do all the processing and get the captioning on there for everyone. But thank you so much to Lake County Women's Coalition, Friends of the Library, the National Park Service, and Susan, of course, for your wonderful information. And we hope you have a wonderful night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.